Greetings, 2%ers. Well, it appears from the comments in my last video on the Toyota with the 0306 misfire that many of you were dissatisfied with the incomplete nature of the diagnosis and my failure to show proof that there was coolant actually in the cylinder and that it was indeed coming from the intake manifold. My diagnosis was a leaking lower intake manifold where the gasket for the coolant passage must have been compromised in leaking coolant directly into the intake runner, but that there wasn't an external leak so that we were getting a vacuum leak at the same time. That was the conclusion I came up with. Some of you took issue with that it wasn't conclusive and it still could have been the cylinder head despite the fact that the compression was normal. And then, well, as you know, I try to make every effort to make this channel a safe haven for people who think scientifically and rationally. And of course, there were the usual comments that I get. Nonetheless, we'll not spend too much time on that. I didn't even do the compression test properly or whatever. I don't know, but we'll talk about that later. But there was also other comments from a number of you guys, particularly voltage drop diagnosis, one-legged Honda mechanic. A number of you guys, sorry, I'll probably recognize you guys a little bit later as we look through the comments, who claimed that the diagnosis that I came up with could not possibly be correct because this model has a dry lower intake. There is no coolant running through the lower intake. Now, obviously, I would agree. If that were the case, which it turns out it is, then it is impossible that my diagnosis could be correct, that it is a coolant leak from the intake manifold because no coolant runs through the intake manifold on this engine. And it does turn out that that is the case. So the purpose of this video, because still, most cars do have the wet intake manifold and the diagnostic procedures I used would have been totally valid. So what I want to do is cover, again, as usual, we focus on the thought process here. The whole point with this channel is how would a guy who doesn't have experience and isn't a professional mechanic use logic and reason and scientific approach to come up with a diagnostic given any number of tools from very basic to some high-end tools. How would such a person, which is most of you who don't have experience, come up with a diagnostic? So it's really important still to understand what happened here. Also why I ruled out certain things that other people brought up that were legitimate. Maybe it's not a coolant leak into the cylinder. Maybe it's a leaking fuel injector. Absolutely good point, and I didn't rule that out. And show my thought process through that, and then also talk about kind of where we're going to go from here. So let's start off with the first thing, and that is actually I opened up the first video with an incorrect, well, it wasn't really an incorrect explanation. I was surprised at seeing the coil with 4 terminals. I was trying to come up with an explanation with that because over on my other channel, we are looking at diagnosis and understanding of ignition systems, and I was thrown off by the 4 terminals. So let's just cover that real quick because a number of you guys with strong electrical backgrounds provided me electrical diagrams that I could look at and clearly see how that works. So we'll cover that first and then we'll go to the intake manifold / cylinder head dilemma. All right, so as most of you guys remember, we had the ignition coil, and what I had said is that this terminal here is going to be a constant positive from the ignition switch. And if you have other coils down the line, this is going to be a sort of constant feed to all the coils eventually from the ignition switch to feed the positive. That is correct. This one would be a constant ground. And again, there would be on these other coils the same shared constant ground on all of these. And that is correct. I also said that this one here would be the signal for that specific coil, but what I was incorrect in is the way that it worked on this model. So I was going to guess that what this was, for those of you guys following on the other channel, a PNP design. So instead of inputting a voltage, which as I described in the video is like the push button to cause the connection between the positive and ground so that we energize the coil, what I was thinking is this was actually the opposite. So basically there is already voltage here, and when it's pulled down through the PCM control, that would be your activation. That is actually not how it works. So it turns out, and I won't spend too much time on this because I know most of you guys want to get to that cylinder head dilemma. But for you guys on the other channel, we will cover this in more detail because this is actually a more interesting design by far. It turns out that this is indeed the NPN design with the input voltage to basically activate the coil to make the current connection through the coil. What this one is this is actually a feedback to the PCM to determine the coil fired. So basically there is a 5 volt here that when the coil fires, it pulls down to ground, so you essentially would get a square wave. Now what's really interesting to me about this, really fascinating, is this wire is shared with the other coils. So it's one wire that gives the feedback for all of the ignition coils, and the PCM somehow would be able to determine that any one coil failed to fire. It must use some inputs from cam or crank or something like that to know the engine's position. But anyway, just wanted to clarify that for you guys because I don't like to give misinformation on the channel for sure. And I was just guessing, again, as I pointed out, on how that design worked, but now we don't have to guess. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody understands that, so we will cover that in more detail on the other channel. Now, let's look at the next thing, and that is, we'll just cover sort of my process, my theory on what I was chasing, and then that will also help answer some of the other questions, like why didn't I chase for a fuel leak from the injector, something like that. So let's take a look at a typical intake manifold for those of you guys who aren't familiar, because a lot of you guys are really confused on what I was doing, and this will make it very clear for you. Okay, on most cars you will have your upper and lower intake manifold design. This is a lower intake manifold, so you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ports here. These are for the intake of air. These ports are connected to these, I call them runners here, and each of these is going to go to a cylinder. Some of them are going to go on the other side, some of them on this side, and that's where the air is brought in through the upper intake manifold. On most cars, you're familiar with that being the plastic top of the engine, which only brings air into the engine. That's the purpose of the top intake manifold. It's also called the plenum. Actually, here's a Toyota. You can see the runners here for the 6 cylinders. So this would be the top part. This one's metal, not plastic. And that's typically what you see on the upper intake manifold. When you remove that, you get to your lower intake manifold. You can see where your runners on the upper intake came off. This is your lower intake manifold. When you remove the lower intake manifold on most models, it will look something like this. So again, you can see where your air inputs are here. But look here, what's that? That is coolant. That right there is a coolant pass. That's a coolant passage. And on some models, these coolant passages can be really close to the intake ports. You can see where you can have this gasket here fail, and that coolant can run right into the intake runner, and that was basically what I was calling on this engine. It would look very much like a head gasket. Remember, here's your intake valve right there. You can see the stem. Coolant goes through there, drifts past the intake valve, pulls into the cylinder. You have coolant in the cylinder. Looks just like a head gasket. And of course, most hacks out there are going to see coolant in a cylinder and say, oh, you got a blown head gasket. Well, as you can see, there is another possible explanation here. This would be your typical intake manifold gasket set for the upper and lower. We can see on the upper, again for V6 here, we've got 6 ports there that this gasket seals the upper intake to the lower intake. Looking at the lower intake gaskets, again, we're going to have two of them, one for each cylinder head. You've got your air intake ports here to help seal from vacuum leaks, but also you've got your coolant channels here. Notice how this coolant channel really close to the intake. If there's a compromise there, you can see where you could potentially get coolant to enter into that intake, but not necessarily have vacuum leak. Now, the problem is, and thanks to several of the viewers who have made comments on this and know what they're talking about, so if we look at one of the cylinder heads here, this is where your lower intake would fit on. Notice no coolant passages. That is a major problem in what I concluded as my diagnosis, because it is impossible that the intake manifold can be leaking coolant. There is no coolant that runs through the lower intake manifold. So basically it's conclusive. My diagnosis is incorrect. If that is accurate, and I don't doubt for a second it is because I checked several sources, then it is not leaking from the intake manifold gasket. So that brings up some of the other questions. Where is the coolant coming from? Has to be from the cylinder head. And also, is it coolant? Which it is, and we'll talk about that. But let's address the one thing, and that is where the coolant's coming from. So it has to be coming from the cylinder head. It's either from the cylinder head gasket or from the cylinder head itself, that there's a crack or something where outside of the combustion chamber, because what I'm going to get at is my problem I'm having is compression test, leak down test, which wasn't shown in the video, by the way, but I did do it, chemical test, every test I did, in fact, including, remember, there's a lot of film that I don't necessarily show, like the leak down test completely negative. But also when I went to visit this woman, I'm anticipating that I'm looking for a blown head gasket. So I brought my chemical tester, my scope to do the relative compression, compression gauge, everything. And one of the things I also did was I even took the dipstick of oil out. The woman had just run the car. We were running the car while I was doing fuel trim analysis. Put a little bit of that oil on that hot exhaust manifold. No sizzle, no moisture in the oil. Every single test was negative, and that's problematic because basically what we're going to conclude here is that it is possible to have a leak in the cylinder linking to the coolant, so basically a compression passage from the cylinder to the cooling system that doesn't cause a loss of compression. To be honest with you, I struggle with that a lot, an awful lot. And we'll talk about some theories on that, but that's basically what we have here. Your only conclusion is you either have that phenomenon or you would have it where there's a crack in the coolant passage up higher on the cylinder head, and that crack for the coolant passage gets to the intake area in there, and that way it would be outside of the combustion chamber. That to me seems like it would be a more reasonable explanation for how come we don't have compression loss, but I don't know, everybody's saying it's a head gasket. One of the things, I did look up all the technical service bulletins. There are no TSBs that mention this as a common failure. Wow. Yeah, it's pretty hard to digest, but obviously I do have to apologize to the shop to blame them for just saying, oh, look, there was coolant on the spark plug or coolant in the cylinder, if they found that, and therefore we're diagnosing a head gasket. Well, in this case, yeah, you could do that. If there's coolant in the cylinder on this model, it's from the cylinder head. There's no question. It's just a matter of how it got there. So we'll talk about that for a second. One of the things I do want to do is also address the question, why did I not look at a leaking fuel injector? And that I'll show who brought that comment up. That is a really good point and one that I did consider. So the thinking on that one is, first of all, if you're leaking fuel into that cylinder from the number 6 injector, which is entirely possible, the thing is that you would absolutely smell that. When you start the car cold, you would smell the fuel. It would stink. It would burn your eyes in the garage. And that didn't happen. The other thing is that the leaking injector would always be leaking. There's no reason that you would explain it's only leaking when it's cold. And what I would expect is rich fuel trims, which I did not see on the car. But of course, after today, nobody's going to believe anything on when something leaks and how. But had I not found coolant in the cylinder, which I 100% did find coolant in the cylinder, had I not, my next step would have been to do a static fuel pressure test, look for a leaking injector. Absolutely. So really good point. And that's why I didn't do it in the video. Once I found the coolant, I stopped there. I guess it's possible we've got leaking coolant in the cylinder and a leaking injector, but I would have dealt with that after fixing the coolant thing. So, but very good point on the leaking fuel, and I did consider that. Let's go and back up a little bit. And a lot of people just had a lot of confusion on what the hell I was doing with the pressurizing the intake, pressurizing the cooling system. What was I looking for? What was the purpose of that? So let's go to the dry erase board of knowledge and make sure everybody understands that. Okay, and real quick, again, regarding that apology to that shop, yes, absolutely. Totally fair call. If there's coolant in the cylinder on that design, it's a cylinder head problem, maybe a gasket, maybe not, but it's definitely a cylinder head problem. Totally agree calling that just from coolant in the cylinder, but you charge the lady for the spark plugs. Still don't agree with that, but the call was probably accurate. Let's look at what is going on here, because this is the design that, of course, I thought I was working with. So we've got our cylinders here in the engine. These are our cylinders, and we see number 6 here. And of course, we're going to have a coolant passage right next to the number 6. So what my thinking is validating that there was coolant in the cylinder, and there were a couple ways that I did that. And one of them I did film, but it didn't show up on camera, so I didn't include it. I did the trick I showed in another video where I took a white sheet of paper and I put it over the spark plug hole, had the engine turn over a few times, you take it off, orange stain on the paper, and as you saw in the video, the coolant is orange, and very, very clearly, and it didn't smell like fuel. It couldn't have been fuel. Remember, I shut off the fuel system to do the cranking compression tests. It was 100%, there is no question. There was coolant in the cylinder. There's no argument about that. So the question is, I'm trying to determine, given the fact that the compression was equal in every cylinder, including the one with the leak. Leak down test was negative. Again, I didn't show it in the video because it seemed duplicative, and we'll talk about that because obviously we've got a challenge where I was lied to on my compression test, it appears. If the compression test is negative, no reason to do a leak down test. Compression test, you're talking 160, 180, sometimes more PSI. Leak down test, you're doing like 80, 90 PSI. If the compression test is negative, no reason to do a leak down. I thought it would make good for the video. I just thought it would be repetitive because there's no reason to do a leak down test when your compression test is negative. The compression test has a higher threshold because of the higher pressures. But let's look at what the strategy was, because this is still a viable strategy on a wet intake so that you don't misdiagnose a head gasket as often. Remember, I believe I'm going off of this design where you've got your coolant next to the cylinder. And this is going to be actually your intake. So this is going to be on the lower intake manifold connecting to the cylinder head. And we've got a gasket here separating these. And what I believe is happening is on the lower intake manifold, we've got a compromise in that gasket that allows coolant to enter the cylinder. How to prove that? So my first theory on proving it was to input compressed air and build up pressure in here. Remember, we're going to be able to build up pressure in this intake manifold by putting in compressed air. I put it in up to, I think it was 15 or 20 PSI, something like that. So, you know, not nearly as much as you'd have on a compression or leak down test, but about 20 PSI of pressure. By pressurizing the intake manifold, what I am hoping to do is I am hoping to drive some of that pressurized air back into the cooling passage, is what I'm hoping to do. So by pressurizing this intake manifold, that compromise, the air is going to get into that compromise, enter the cooling system, and then one of a couple things would happen. What I was really hoping would happen is ultimately this cooling system is going to come out at the radiator neck, and that's why I topped off the coolant all the way up to the top of the radiator neck. It took like half a cup to top it off. But the reason is because I wanted that coolant there so that eventually this air in the cooling system would hopefully reach up here and bubble out the top, and we would see the bubbles, kind of like on a leak down test, except we would be doing it through the intake manifold instead of through the cylinder. And admittedly, that never happened, and many of you guys pointed that out, and you were right. I never got bubbles coming up out of the radiator neck, and what I did, though, is listen, and I heard at the back of the engine a gurgling sound. And what I did was I connected, well, because I'm pressurizing the intake, not the combustion chamber. The gurgling sound has to come from my entering air into this cooling jacket. And admittedly, not 100% conclusive. Many of you guys had issue with that, and you were absolutely correct. But it was the only explanation I could come up with. You can clearly see now that I have a major problem in that since there wasn't a cooling jacket here, pressurizing the intake could not have possibly caused a gurgling sound. So I'm not sure where that came, but you heard it on the video. You absolutely heard it. So that's the theory here. There was another method that I did too, and the other method was the opposite of this. The second method was I put my compressed air into the radiator neck. Now, as you guys mostly are familiar with, I actually have a special tool for this that can give quantitative results. It's a Stant, I believe it's Stant, yeah, Coolant System Pressurizer tool. Actually, let me go ahead and grab it just in case some of you guys haven't seen this. And what this tool is, it's basically like a bicycle pump with a gauge on it, and you've got these different adapters that you can put onto the radiator neck depending on the radiator cap size you have and the design. And then you seal that on, you just pump it up. As you pump it up, it builds pressure up in the system, which you can read on the gauge here. And my strategy, of course, would be to pump it up to a fixed pressure and let it sit. If there's a leak in the system, then we're going to see what we call decay, or that loss of pressure as the coolant is pushed out through the leak. We would see that dial start dropping because of the loss in pressure in the system. If you lose, boy, even a pound or two of pressure within 5 minutes, you have a leak in the system. It should stay static for quite some time. Obviously, that's what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, on that model, I just didn't have an adapter that I could use that pump. So what I did was I just stuck a cork with a hole in it and then used my compressed air to pump air through that hole. Remember, there's also a bleed-off overflow valve here that goes into your overflow tank. So I just pinched that off so that the air wouldn't go into the overflow tank. This pressurizes the cooling system, builds a whole bunch of air into the cooling system to pressurize it. And if there is a compromise in that gasket, well, obviously, it's going to push both coolant and air out of there. And a couple things are going to happen. You're going to hear it gurgle, which I did. The other thing that will happen is you are going to build up coolant into the cylinder as I'm pushing that coolant past that gasket. And in the case of the intake manifold, it would drip into the intake runner, past the intake valve, and drip from the intake valve into the cylinder. Now, one other thing about this test, though, and this is where I think people got confused, is what if you don't have a compromise in the intake manifold gasket. So you're building up your coolant pressure, but you got coolant into the cylinder as a result of this test because you have a leaking head gasket. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, that's a variable. And that's why this test wasn't alone conclusive. It was in conjunction with the test of pressurizing the intake, also hearing the gurgle, which I can't explain why that happened, and the fact, remember, that we did cylinder compression tests and found there was no loss of compression. If we have a leak in the cylinder head gasket, well then of course pressurizing the cooling system, putting it into this combustion chamber because of the cylinder head gasket, yes, that would put coolant in there. However, if we were to do a compression test or a leak down test, well, the opposite would happen. We would pressurize and we would put pressure from the cylinder into the cooling system. In the case of a compression test, we would see lower compression in this cylinder as every other cylinder builds up 160 psi of compression that we showed. This cylinder would have showed less compression because the compression, some of it's going into the cooling system. The other thing that would happen is on my leak down test, when I pressurize this cylinder with 90 psi, we're going to drive that air into the cooling system. That is going to cause the coolant to just absolutely bubble over. And we've seen that in many videos. Neither of those happened. So how did the coolant get into the cylinder? Well, I was saying it was obviously from the intake manifold. Unfortunately, not possible because there's no cooling jackets on this intake manifold. So why was the compression test negative? I've been doing this 8 years now, and one thing I've always known, compression tests don't lie. I believe 100% in the compression tests. And now we've got two problems. First of all, it appears that the compression test lied on this model. And second of all, there is no reason now to suspect that even if you have a wet lower intake and your compression test is negative, it still could be that it's from a cylinder head gasket or whatever. I got to admit, I'm really having trouble believing that at those really, really, really high pressures, that even a pinhole leak wouldn't cause some loss in the pressure. But we saw it both with the relative compression and the gauge. There was no compression loss. One explanation that I have for that would be a flap effect. And that would be something like this, where, let's say this is a terrible drawing, but let's say we've got our spark plug hole here where the spark plug would go in. And we have a gasket failure that's something like this. So if we do a compression test, or better yet, we're going to use an example of a leak down test where we're going to force air at 90 psi, or compression test using the piston at 160 psi, even more if the engine's running. And what happens is this flap is open here, which allows access to the cooling passage. But when we pressurize it, we push that flap back and we seal the system, which would mean our compression and leak down tests would be negative. In fact, maybe the more pressure you put on, the more it seals. However, the cooling system, if we do not have this pressure applied, is generally, what's a cooling system under? Probably 12 psi or so, 15 at the most. Obviously, my argument, why are we getting coolant into the system with only 12 psi, but we don't have pressure entering the cooling system at 90 psi? Well, one reason is because this 12 psi is pushing outward on that flap, so the coolant can get in when only the coolant is pressurized. but when the cylinder's pressurized, shuts it off. The problem with that is really hard to believe that you would have that condition, but it does scientifically explain it. So what I'm actually more likely to believe is that it may not be from the gasket, but it may be above the gasket, outside of the compression chamber. I just have trouble believing that. I can't trust a compression and leak down test now, but more research definitely to be done. All right, so obviously I have no doubt that this car does not have a wet lower intake, so wrong diagnosis, completely owning up to it, but I just don't want people to think that the procedures that I did were invalid. They are totally valid if you have a wet intake, which I thought we did. So the other thing is I don't want people to go the other direction and jump to the thing that a lot of people do, and that is, see, I told you, anytime you got coolant in the cylinder or on the spark plug, it's a blown head gasket. You don't need to do your stupid fancy tests and all this science diagnosis. Yeah, you do, but just not on this model engine. So the thing is that I don't want you guys to think, oh, well, what I'm going to take away from this is anytime I see coolant in a cylinder, it's blown head gasket. Absolutely not. I have other videos that show conclusively exactly the phenomenon that I suspected, where the coolant was leaking from the intake manifold. And as a matter of fact, I caught it on a bore scope. Another common comment that you guys made, why didn't I use a bore scope? And the reason is because, quite honestly, I didn't think it was necessary. I thought that the tests were conclusive enough with the negative on the pressure tests in the combustion chamber, but what I thought was a positive on the pressure test in the intake. In retrospect, definitely boroscope if this car comes back, for sure. So this brings up now another question, and that is, what would have happened if I had fixed the car for this owner? So as you guys know, my policy is, if I make a diagnosis and I make a repair off that diagnosis, or the customer makes a repair off my diagnosis, and I'm wrong, I pay for that repair. So right now there was nothing to pay for because my diagnoses are always free. Just so you guys know, had I had the car come back to me for the intake manifold repair, obviously I would have run into a major shock when I remove the lower intake and find that there's no coolant passages, and I would have known right then my diagnosis was wrong. What I would have done is I would have replaced the lower intake manifold gasket and put everything back together. I would have told the customer I made the wrong call. I didn't realize the design of this car. It's definitely a head gasket issue. I would not have charged for the repair that I did. And what I would do is I would offer a pretty steep discount for the cylinder head gasket replacement if they wanted to do that. If it was a cylinder head gasket, remember, I'm still not convinced it's the gasket. But that's how I would have handled that. All right, that's going to conclude this video. Obviously, I'm going to get all the comments from people who said, I've seen this a million times and I told you it was this and that. Absolutely not. If I had this to do over again in the future and I get a 2004 Toyota with this exact same engine that has a misfire at number 6, I am absolutely 100% going to do exactly the same diagnostic procedures I did before, minus the pressurizing the intake manifold, of course. I would rule out compression problems. I would rule out that there was a ignition problem. I would rule out leaking fuel injectors. I would confirm that there was absolutely coolant in the cylinder, and if there was not, I'm not going to just jump to the conclusion. So you guys that just base things off of historical evidence or what everybody says, you're still not getting the point. I wanted to make sure that you also understand that the compression test is where my issue is. No matter how you look at it, whether you do relative compression or the gauge, it doesn't matter. We had no compression loss with a compromise between a combustion chamber and a cooling system. I'm speechless about that, and I still have trouble believing it. So, as usual, I wanted to create an environment where we learn a lot from the comments, sometimes more than from the videos. I would love to hear from you guys who know what you're talking about, please. How do you explain that? How can you explain a 12 psi of pressure from the cooling system, and even less than that because most of the time it's at rest when the coolant pulls in? How is that getting into a combustion chamber through a head gasket, but 200 psi of pressure doesn't go into the cooling system? That's what I would like to see an explanation of, and maybe we'll follow it up on the next video and actually test some applications if I see some really good theories on that. But man, I'm struggling. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Sorry about the misdiagnosis on that there, and we'll make up for it if this car comes back, and we'll show exactly what's going on with it with borescope and everything if I get a chance. Hopefully I get the car back. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.